How have you been doing, by the way? How's
I'm
life?
doing really well.
Good. That's good to
Yeah.
hear. I can't exactly, I'm pretty good. But it's such a strange time that that we've been locked up for so long that I'm really not quite sure. You know, things are different, so I don't really have a baseline of how to feel exactly. Too much
Yeah,
time at home, too many people not out, too much standing in line, too many masks. I mean, it's an interesting time, I have to say.
like a twilight zone some days.
Yeah, okay. Yeah, that's a pretty good description.
Mm.
Um, so uh, a little bit of like history of I'm going to use a word to describe. If you don't like it, then let me know. But I think that you have some of your teachings and some of your learnings have been around the shamanic understandings, the
Yeah.
shamanic way in the world, which I would define as, you know, transformation and learning about yourself and all that is, with the assistance of plant allies, to be
Yes.
able to you know, really be able to experience how the world actually works, what the energy of things are. Would you how would you characterize shamanic?
Yeah, I think it's absolutely perfect. I think the type of work that we need nowadays is neo shamanism. So I think
Okay,
that plant allies is a big part of it. I think the main thing is it's facilitating altered states.
facilitating what?
Altered states.
Altered states, yes. Okay, so if I could get you to define shamanic a little bit, and then I'm going to get to the nouveau neo shamanic part of it directly after. So, um, what would you what is shamanic, and maybe what is traditional shamanic, and then we can compare it to nouveau or neo.
Well, shamanism essentially, and it's an undisputed fact, is historically the oldest religion that we know. All things branch off it. And shamanism traditionally, if you think about it, there's a couple of factors to it. But one of the things is using parts of earth and medicines from earth to help people to heal. Another big part of shamanic principles, ancient and modern day, is the holding of the space for an initiatory period, some sort of a
Right.
birth or yeah, and I think neo shamanism is just because in the modern world, obviously the space has changed. We're not living in jungles. Um, we are facilitating these kind of spaces in a modern world, and it's different.
Yes. Yeah, the same way I teach and talk about the Eastern traditions, yogic philosophy, Hinduism, Buddhism, etc., is a lot of like Ashtanga, the eight limbs, um, etc., is that the designs, the ancient designs for these programs were for monks that were living within a community that was practicing these things. Everything was designed, your entire day was designed around the teachings, and that you had elders and community and gurus to be able to guide you. And we've seen the value of these materials, except we're not monks. We don't have these communities. So we have to have children and live in your own house and have a job and a spouse and then still be trying to apply them. So there is, which I would call more of transformation, is the West took all of the teachings of the East and they took out the ritual, the new languages, usually Sanskrit or something, and the mythology and the religion, and then what they were left with is just the human condition, and that, you know, what are the teachings about the human condition, and then how do you move forward. So that's the comparison that I would make. Anything you can add to the shamanic side of that?
Yeah, I think firstly what you're saying is really interesting because you're right. We've taken as much of the core as we can from the Eastern teachings. And of course, just like in shamanism, some unfortunate things have bled in, such as adding a bit of a goal-based understanding to Eastern philosophy. Modern
What based?
shamanism, a goal-based system. We have a very
Oh,
goal-based
oh, Oh, yeah. Mm-hmm.
Even this idea that exists in all of spirituality now, this idea of enlightenment. If you look at a lot of the original Eastern teachings, enlightenment was only the entry level. It was the ability to just see. It didn't mean anything else than you can actually see now. There were many levels beyond that of learning to anchor that presence actually into your physical life. And it would be similar in shamanism, because what we're doing is we're essentially facilitating a space for you to feel safe enough, whether we're using breath, sound, or plants, to go into an altered state deep enough for you to experience, let's call it an absolutely transcending moment, for you to get, like the Eastern gurus that facilitate that space, for you to get your enlightening moment. But that does not mean that suddenly you're enlightened. It means that you can see and that you have a different perspective on things. What do you think about that? The idea of enlightenment just being a doorway or an entry level?
Yeah, getting a glimpse. I think what you're pointing to is getting a glimpse of the nature of the whole and your part in it, and that you're part of it. And when I say a glimpse, and a fleeting glimpse at that, it doesn't take away from how miraculous it is.
No,
And it's experiential. It's absolutely experiential. You can't tell anybody. You can't explain it. You've either had it or you haven't had it. And if you have had it, then, you know, the reason why I say it's a glance is that the next day you have a experience of it, a memory of it, but being able to align your life perfectly with it is, you know, a lifetime of work, frankly. But it also changes the everyday, is that there's a lightness in being. There's a weight of the universe is kind of lessened its load on your back a little bit, that you're able to have more faith and more direct experience of your, what I would call godliness, or the miracle that you are, or your greatness. So that's what I would say to that.
I think one thing that we leave out, and it's because I feel it's a little bit toxic. I feel like we've romanticized spirituality. So in this awakening moment that we're speaking about, you become, let's say, new-eyed to where you're currently standing. But often when we become aware or awake, or we have this transcendental experience of what truly is, we might be standing amongst such a mess with so many traumas, and then I think there's a bit of a messy period where we have to now take that vision and that possibility that we're aware of, that we're holding within us, as our guide, but we have a lot to work through, and that's, I think, what we call shadow work in shamanism. There's often so wounds there, and I think that people are often a little bit disappointed after they have an awakening moment to realize just how raw and just how human we need to be to sift through all of this stuff. What are your thoughts on the initiations and the traumas that people experience long after awakening?
So there's just a point of clarity first would be, when you says that you think there's a romanticized take on spirituality, you know, kind of underline that a little bit, if you could illustrate the romantic side of spirituality a little bit.
Sure. I mean, well, we'll start with just a definition of what I mean by the romantic side being toxic. Is even in our relationships, we have this idea of how things should be, and then there's how things should be. So the romanticism in spirituality is this idea that if you are spiritual, you are sitting somewhere peaceful, absolutely in calm, and connected to everything. Whereas I would argue it's spirituality is more of a, like we were speaking about the in-breath and the out-breath. So all I mean is it's expanded states and collapsed states. And when we're expanded, we have a myopic view of the universe, so we can experience being one with all things. And that is that state that we've romanticized, but it does exist. But then there's also the responsibility stage where after periods of growth, we almost become insular and we close in. And that's the part that we don't speak about spirituality a lot. And it's like kind of closing off to all the other rivers just for a while so that we can take responsibility for what we've got going on. And that's,
Sure.
I think we don't discuss the sacredness of initiation, of dark nights, of periods of loneliness. And just in closing, the reason why I think it's toxic is you guys run such a beautiful community, and I've seen so many beautiful communities. And what I've seen around the world is that often people, when they are going through those periods, because it's not a dialogue that is open in the spiritual communities, we tend to think something's wrong, we've got lost, we've made a mistake, and in a state of shame, we actually pull away from the very community that has facilitated us to get to that place.
Mm. Yeah. So in regards to the romanticizing part, I do think a lot of people believe that. I think a lot of people pretend, as long as they are trying to be kind and that they've listened to some audios and attempted meditation, that they're there, and they have no idea. And then the people that actually have had, most people who have had a shamanic experience where they've invoked the help of how Terence McKenna says it, they've cut a deal with a plant to be able to come to their own transformation, is that they do have a glimmer, a glimpse of all that is, and the immense collaboration of the universe and their connection in it. And then, but you spoke about the contracting part, and that where you're that's at least, it's a very the opening part and the connected part is like the beacon in the fog, and being able to go, that feels right. And I had an experience of knowingness, maybe for the first time in my life, and when you are in knowingness is the opposite of doubt. You're not experiencing any doubts because you're aligned with who you are and what you are and where you are and all that is. And it's also fleeting, is that knowingness, once you're raising your frequency or your vibration with the help of a plant, and that when the plant is passed through your system, and that you've been able to be a voyeur in a much more expanded world and self, and aligned self, when that passes, that the experience is left with you, but also what's left you is the contractions, is that, and now you might be able to have a little bit more vision to go, even though you're in that contraction and you find your feet in the mud, that you look down and you go, oh, I'm in the mud. And that you understand what that mud is. You start being able, the more you can understand the lower frequencies, and what Bashar would call that we are the masters of lack, is the frequency that society is set at, that we've been socialized to feel lack and see lack. So there's a lack of love and a lack of money and a lack of compassion and a lack of food and a lack of jobs and a lack of good men and a lack. There's just a lack, and which is not true. It's a frequency. So the pointing to the work that needs to be done is being able to sit in the mud and see the mud for what it is, and being able to see the transformational part, and the heart mind part is being able to see the lie in the frequency, in the lower frequencies, and start challenging the validity of those frequencies, so they can start using your mind to raise your frequency. And the more that you're actually able to do that, the more you can live in the higher frequencies of all that is, and how amazing that it is, and amazing that you are, and that you can increase the frequency of time that you spend there, and the amounts of time that you spend there in your life. And that's getting to work. There's work involved there. So
Absolutely.
Did that spark anything with you?
Yes, absolutely. I actually am aligning quite strongly with what you're saying. There's a saying by a shaman in the Arapaho tribe, I think it was like around 1910, and he said that a shaman has to be able to soar with eagles and crawl with bugs. I'll give you a shamanic analogy. If you think about it, we're using this word romanticized again. We've romanticized the higher frequencies to be something that we have to so reach up for that we are almost ignoring a big aspect of ourselves. If you imagine myself in a tree, because as you said, we're using plants to guide us, I have roots that go really, really deep down. And whether I am consciously experiencing myself as being the roots in the darkness, under warmth and pressure, and or whether I'm experiencing the leaf that's dancing in the sun, having this enlightened experience, I'm still the tree, essentially. And I will give you a modern neurology example of how what they were expressing, even in the tree of life, the above and the below, is in our brains. It's quite a fascinating thing that most neo-shamanistic practices will show you, is any form of trance involves slowing down or switching off of the frontal area. Now, the frontal area of our brain is the one that gives us a personal identity. It's when we shut the doors of the room and no one else can come in. So we stop believing we're the house, we're just aware of the room. And it's very interesting because as soon as you take away the I, the me, suddenly you move into another area or the state and you experience all things. And I like the way that you said fleeting state, because we have really, really brought this narrative into modern spirituality where when the room doors are closed, in other words, you might be lonely, you know experientially that you are one with all things, but you feel so separate. That is a sacred state. And we have this narrative that there is something wrong, we've got lost. And I would like us to just perceive the possibility that when we're expanding, we get an even more myopic idea of just how magnificent our life path is going to be. So that when it's time to close again and the door shut, to not think something's gone wrong, but to consider this is how each part of us that makes up the universe gets to now look around the room and take responsibility for what it is they're pushing out the door. So I think this collapsing state can be, our perception towards it can be changed. And you could be more gentle with yourself and not ask questions like, where did I go wrong? Has God left me? Or my angels, whatever works for you, have they? Yeah, I think that's really important. Is I've noticed so many people afraid that something has gone wrong. And meanwhile, and the word we use in shamanism, they're going through one of the great initiations. They are the initiations of the piercing of the heart, which would be your ultimate heartbreak. There are initiations of the piercing of the mind, which is where you feel like you're actually going crazy. So there's all these great initiations that are taught in shamanism. And if we could learn to hold space for that in a community, can you imagine how powerfully we'd emerge? We tend to hit that period, pull back. Yeah. What comes up about?
Go ahead.
I was just wondering, where are you at with this? What are you feeling about this conversation? What comes up for you?
The first thing that came out for me is when you were pointing to the frontal lobe and talking about that's where our identity is, that's where all the labels are of, you know, which when people are finding fault with self, it's where the inner dialogue is. But also there's the back brain, the reptilian brain, where fears come up. Because when you also have to quiet the back brain when you are at some point or another, when you activate a plant ally, there is the rising of the frequency and what you have referred to as an altered state or a different experience of all that is. The way I talk about it is that we are now taking in more data of how things truly are, as opposed to our limited view of things with our neuroinhibitors, and the synapse allows us only to take in so much information. And when you start messing with those inhibitors, you're starting to take in a whole lot more information, which can be very energetic and very displacing for people to be able to deal with the fact that the wall is breathing around them. And so that there's this relationship that you have to have with your back brain or your reptilian brain, which is being able to calm your fears and push your fears aside, or being able to realize that you're safe and that you're okay. Usually it's by coming to breath. If you can meditate, you are definitely way ahead of the game, which means you're able to come to experience and be able to stop putting attention and energy into our random focus, which is our intellect and our inner dialogue, which is giving a constant commentary on everything. Being a human being points to just the beingness of it, and that you can just be in this experience. So there is the frontal lobe and there's the back brain, that both of those things need to be addressed in your experience of what it is that you're doing. Okay, so having said that, what is, like, how difficult, you know, to be able to give people an idea that haven't had that experience? I think you talking about the front brain and identity, and me talking about the inner dialogue and the back brain and fear, it could look like a insurmountable ability of competence to become next to the planets. So, and I don't think it is, but I would like to know what your take on that is that, you know, there is some work to do there, but it's not insurmountable. So what would you say to be able to reassure somebody that this is that, you know, you got this?
Yeah, it's a very interesting question. Is that you know, I think the people that tend to go onto the internet and write about their experience, they're always the ones that have really done the absolute, what did you say, the extremes of things. I don't think a lot of people realize with these plants that you can actually take quite a gentle, slow approach towards it. And also, I mean, people ask a lot of questions that it's almost like there's a lot of mythology around, but could something go wrong? And I personally have never ever seen it. So, but what I can tell you is there are possibilities. So this is a discussion I would have, is I'll put it this way, is we have, let me put it to you this way. If you have a friend who is extremely affectionate and he is a male, but he has such a different way of being with men, he can just love them openly. Often we don't even know that that kind of relationship exists. And in experiencing it, we might find ourselves opening to that kind of emotion or that kind of love. So that would be a simplification of what I feel the plants do. There are emotions, there are feelings, and there are vibrational experiences that many people don't know even exist. I don't feel that the plant leaves you there, but I feel like sometimes the plant takes your hand and it shows you, you know how you believe that physical is everything, or you know how you believe that you don't actually plan the difficult stuff you go through, and it takes your hand. So let's use the example you were using, and maybe for that period, you might have 10 or 20 minutes where you're feeling extremely insecure and you're working through something. But the key that I found that absolutely shifts people is to have that 20-minute period where they sit in an absolute orgasmic connective bliss. Now, why? For the simple reason that most people do not even realize how expansive the state can get. And next time they're meditating, it's like just knowing where that vibrational escrow is. They're able to find it again. A lot of people report that once they've worked with plants, that they have a type of love that they didn't even know exists. They were quite cynical towards how people show them love, and they come to a community like yours where people are so open and they're actually suspicious. They're like, and once you've experienced that kind of love glowing from yourself, you realize, you know what? It's not that it doesn't exist. It's not something I'm tapping into. So I think all I'm really saying there is what I think the plants are most important for us is the difficult side is it might guide you to go and have a look at something that's subconsciously affecting every part of your life. To that part, to how do we hold that space and why, I would say, would you rather have 15 or 20 minutes where you're crying or you're upset, where you have affecting? You still with me? I broke off there for a second.
Sorry, you just froze and disappeared there for a second. It's nice to see that you're back.
Yeah, so saying to me, can you hear me again?
Yep.
Yeah, so the supposed negative side to me is I would rather go through a period of difficulty and not having this thing subconsciously controlling me for the rest of my life. But on the positive side, when people ask if it's fleeting, once you realize those areas of love, those areas of connection, you realize they exist, your entire mind opens up next time you close your eyes, next time you're doing yoga, next time you're sitting staring at the sea. And you realize, you know what, it's not that it's not there, it's that I'm not reaching out for it. And somehow,
Yes.
once you found a radio station once, you somehow so much quicker know where to go on the radio. And it might take you a little bit of, I know it's around here, I know it's around here, but that's the most important thing. And it's interesting, we're talking about the brain. Probably the most common question I get asked is because it's so researched now. People ask me what I think about the way that it changes the neurons in your brain, and is that why it cures depression? I honestly think the number one reason why we're helping people with depression is because people that are depressed are in a very long, closed state, and they actually start convincing themselves that all exists are the four walls, even though their narrative might be saying something different. And to take something like a plant and just give them that hour or two where they can myopically expand, I think that is the majority of the reason why the depression lifts. I know there's a chemical aspect to it, it's very researched, but I think just to experience that this is not just me is so relieving for depressed people.
Mm. Just to speak a little bit about, so a couple of things that you mentioned there, I think I'm going to go backwards. So one of the last things that you said, in being able to escape a prison made by your own mind, which means made by your own beliefs. And the more time that we spend in that prison, that's four walls that are closing in on you about the lacks, how lacking your life is and how lacking you might be, which when you get next to one of the plants, it really blows you past any of that stuff. And rising you up to something else that you talked about was a blissful state. So you might have to deal with, as your frequency changes from a lower frequency to a higher frequency when you first ingest one of the plants. But once you've actually gone through that, whatever that turbulence is, once you're there, you're having a blissful experience of you and all your is, and really for the first time, being able to realize how much you belong, a sense of belonging in something that is so incredibly huge, and your place in it is warranted and equal to anything else that exists or is in existence. And the bliss that goes with that, the natural nature of what is blissful and loving, and being able to have that experience. A lot of people do say in their first or even their last experiences around the allies, the plant allies, is how lovely the experience is. And then the one part in the middle that you talked about was that you're having to deal with, like maybe you cry or maybe something goes on with you, but it's not happening to you. It's virtually that, would you agree that if you're crying or there's a lid been taken off some inner Tupperware where you're hiding, you know, things you don't want to deal with and you don't know how to deal with, and it's your own trauma, and that the lid's been loosened off because the universe knows that stuff is better understood and out than afraid of and in. And that you talk about, you also mentioned patterns, is that there's patterns in your life of maybe certain things happening again and again earlier on in the conversation. And that stuff, if whatever you're not dealing with internally, you will unconsciously, you externalize it, and you have the very thing that you're not dealing with and you can be dealing with just with your inner emotions, you externalize it, and then the world starts giving you hassles in alignment with what you're not dealing with. So that's my take. Would you agree that if you are having any kind of experiences that you're dealing with, you know, that's what you're not dealing with in life, and kind of the point and the value of the plant?
Yeah, I think that's absolutely perfectly explained. Um, you know, we're talking about essentially what it is that we hold within us, and I think that something that keeps people already afraid and away from plants is this idea that something's going to, some problem from somewhere else is going to come towards us, and it's actually
Yes.
far more personal than that. They hear someone will say, "Well, can it get difficult?" Yes, it can get difficult, but it's your difficult, and
Mm.
there's no idea of some other problem coming to you. It's exactly as you say. And what's incredible is people also think that they're going to relive something like being in some war movie, and it's not exactly like that. You tend to be able to see things without, let's call it, beliefs and a narrative, because when something happens to us, we build a story around it. And where
Mm.
we see that prevalently in the plants is all the people that have written all these sacred texts and all these sacred books, they've essentially had an experience with eternity. And now, because we live in a linguistic reality, they try and linguistically anchor it. And I take spiritual texts very seriously, but far less seriously nowadays. And the reason why I say that is they texts and beliefs and books, they're an incredible thing to get you to climb up to stairs to a point where you're ready to dive. And the example is such as you have, if you have a transcendental experience or if you have an orgasmically bliss God experience on plants, none of the levels of all the stuff you studied and none of the, all of that falls away. The good, the bad, terms like where did I come from, terms like where am I going, terms like what am I becoming, none of that makes sense when you move into that eternal realm. All questions completely dissolve. People
Mm.
always say, just get back into a transcendental state. I've got so many questions. And what a lot of us try and explain to them that travel with the plants often is you can't take the questions in because they don't make any sense while you're in there. Those
Yeah.
questions are born of your mind. And it's only when
Mm.
you come back to a state of separation, you suddenly want to believe, for instance, that you are from anywhere but Earth. It's like a disconnect that we don't want to believe that we're meant to be here. Most spiritual people are kind of just biding their time. There's a very strong narrative like, yeah, I'm from somewhere else and this is not my mess and these are not my people. And it allows us to completely check out. Whereas shamanism is not arguing that you might have parts somewhere else, but we need to acknowledge that we are earthlings, that we are here, that we are present, anchored here, and I think we should stop checking out.
Mm. Yes,
But you'll,
we wake up every day. So, and that's interesting. The last thing that you talked about was checking out. So just hang on. And that you also talked about the ancient texts, and yet you used the analogy of the stairway. And much of the material about transformation on the human condition side, I've been able to learn through text of somebody else's descriptions of their inner world that I was able to apply across to myself and be able to use those distinctions for me. So the ancient texts have been really useful in that way, but I still need to be able to have a knowledge of my inner world to use those distinctions, and then the experiential of actually doing it to know the value. With the teacher plants, when you're talking about the writings, they will get you up the stairway to be able to jump off a cliff, and then you're relying on your own wings, and that it really is the experience on the other side is so beyond the intellectual understanding that the words give you. So you're right. I like your analogy of it's a stairway to get you to the top. And I've recently really started listening a lot to how much Terence McKenna is resonating with me. And one of the things that he says, just to align with that even a little bit further, is he talks about, you don't need any kind of historical lineage to be able to, like, there's a lot of fallacy as far as he's concerned that there's a lineage you need to be a part of, or else you're not going to be taken care of, or you're not going to know what you're doing. And I think, like, standing on the shoulders of giants to be able to see as far as I do is worth the work that I've had to do to understand them. But also is being able to know that I haven't followed any lineage, zero, in regards to the teacher plants, and you can have your own relationship with them. That's how those lineages were created in the first place, and that and they have value. But I don't live in the jungle, and I'm not part of a tribe in South America. Once again, and I'm not a monk. So in the same way, I've bonded in with my own relationship with each one of these plants, which is perfect. You don't need, so a lot of people say that it doesn't matter about the plant, it matters about the shaman, and I'm saying no, the shaman matters not, as long as he's not messing with things and not messing with you. The plant will take care of you. And it's a really good idea to have a good shaman. I mean, I'm all for ceremony, but it's like, and certainly somebody that's starting, you definitely should go in ceremony. And some of the plants, maybe I've only done in ceremony because it's kind of designed that way. But it's not necessarily that you're not going to be taken care of if there isn't a 5,000-year heritage of something or lineage of something. So the plants will take care of you. And the other thing about that is that there's a lot of, like with iboga and ibogaine, is, as an example, is that there is a synthetic version, which is just looking at one active ingredient, as opposed to when you're right next to the plant itself, there's all these other alkalines that are in there that are interacting with you as what I would call a safety net, is that these plants are having these effect on humans because they're supposed to. And that, as Bashar would say, is that each one of them has their own tutelage. Each one of them is teaching people something, that is useful in their life. And the order that you do them in, or if you only do one, and if you only do it once, that's really up to you. So I don't know if that sparked anything or took you off track in there, but anything to add to that?
No, absolutely. I mean, just going back a few minutes where you were about lineage, I think that there's a lot of cultural amorphization going on where people are pretending or wanting to be or genuinely connected to a tribe. One of those three. Maybe you've really done the work with that tribe. And I think that there's a word, funny enough, you said Bashar, so let's use his word, a permission slip. And the thing about permission slip is that there's this idea that you don't really have your spiritual anchoring presence that's with each person with actually having it given to you by someone else. And it's a very interesting conversation, but I personally agree with you. If your facilitator really knows what they're doing and does not pull away from the space in any way, I do feel that it is the plant and you that does everything. So my thoughts on the shamanism thing would be, and it's why I don't use the word shaman itself much, is we've coming from thousands of years of placing a person between you and eternity. Our churches do, and to me that's slightly different to a guru, because in the Eastern sense, a guru didn't really give you answers. It would be quite frustrating. If you look at Zen Buddhism, they would drive you insane. They essentially would lead you to find yourself as the answer, which is exactly what plants do in their own way. So the problem with the whole shaman thing in the Western world is, I think that if you look at how circles have evolved, the first thing is this idea that if you're not doing it the way that they did it hundreds of years ago, there's a romanticism there. And I'll tell you why. The romanticism is that every time tribes drank medicine, they were trying to become enlightened. Now, you spoke about Terence McKenna, but there's many anthropologists who tell you that when they drank plants, they even used it to do intertribal warfare with each other. So these shamans were not supposed, these tree-hugging, happy, they want to get everyone enlightened. The romanticism is, the part that's true is how connected to earth and rivers and plants. But the romanticism lies in the fact that they weren't necessarily enlightened people. There's a lot of superstition that was very, very prevalent in the jungles. And it's a well-recorded fact of shamans actually attacking shamans. And so why I bring that out is I think there's almost something refreshing in the modern world about when 10 people come together in a shamanic community and they approach the plants. I personally believe, because of the reason we're using it, every one of us are asking the plant the same thing. Show me what I can't see. Guide me to my eternal presence. And I think that that's ancient consciousness, like the plant. I think the plant is actually evolving with our question. So I think
I
that,
agree.
yeah, there's a saying that Abraham Lincoln used to say. He used to say that our doctrines of the quiet past cannot suffice in our stormy present. So I think, to surmise what I'm saying, is that the responsibility that every single person who's guiding people at the moment stands in, whether it's yoga, whether it's shamanism, is to pull what we need, what is wisdom, without arrogance from the past, but also to throw away what no longer serves us, like the parts about fear and interwarfare and separation. Yeah, so very interesting line of thought that you've opened up here.
So just a little bit. So what would you see as the greatest benefits to you by illustration of how your life is different now, pointing to not necessarily the specifics, but of what was wrong, but more of the specifics of what's better now? What would you point to in regards to the plants and your journeys with them and the teachings?
Interesting question. I think for me, the big thing was I think a lot of us are these trepid searchers, and there's certain questions that we really want answered, and this need or the search that we go on can be quite comical, if anything. And no matter what answer I got, it just never really sufficed. And I think for me, it wasn't so much an awakening when I started working with plants. It was more like finally getting answers that actually made sense. But they're so profound, the answers that I found, that I couldn't even anchor them back into words. But it put those questions, which were essentially just my mind gnawing at me, they put them at such ease. To the point where some days I know what the truest version to that question is, but I can't even experience it. But just knowing that it's there. So I'll give you a silly example, is I certainly know I'm not separate. Some days I feel very, very separate, but I know not because I read it in a book. And I like your word experiential. And I know not because a guru told me. And I know for a fact because I have stood and felt I felt a planet moving, and it's felt like my own finger moving. I've experienced how one I am with everything. So for me, I would say guidance, cutting through a lot of mental ideas. The thing that plants have done for me most is they've collapsed linguistic side for me more. So I've gone from having many words to saying, yes, I understand your words. It's not quite like that. You just need to alter and see. Yeah.
Beautiful. The next question I was going to ask, which I think you already have, but I'm going to ask it anyway, is do you think you could have reached your understanding that you have now without the plants in this lifetime?
That's a very interesting question. I think that the understanding was already there and is there for a lot of people, but it wasn't completely experiential. I think I did need to be taken to actually experience those things as what you called earlier lighthouse. I know that Terence McKenna used to joke about the fact that people thought that this was really amusing, that these people in the jungle, or that people that did it, thought that there was some way to fast forward your spirituality. And he said, well, if you think it's a fast forward, you've obviously never experienced it. Because although you have the mental experience, you might, for the next 3 weeks of your life, actually be aware of what it is that you've been doing without knowing you've been doing it. And becoming present to that has been extremely difficult for me.
Mm.
Sometimes the unlayering and having that next level of shadow to own. So I'm actually, in honesty, I'm not sure. I think that the plants have been extremely valuable for me. What I do,
my personal opinion, sorry for interrupting, is I'll slide it in here with your answer is, I absolutely know without the plants that there's no way I would have the knowing that I do today. And there's absolutely no way. I don't advocate the plants to everyone. It's not for everyone, but it certainly worked for me. And that I would not be the same human being without it. There's things that you can't get here. You can't get there from here with your mind. You cannot get that experience on your own. So, and I think that's why the plants are here. I think they're here to be able to expand our minds beyond what we have to do to function, what we have to do to, operate in society, and the fact that we've been socialized by it is that, and then the leap that is possible, and what you can actually see the truth is of who you are and how helpful that is. My life, there's no way that, and it's the same thing like when I talk about standing on the shoulders of giants in my readings about the Buddhists and the Vedas and the Hindus and all the Eastern philosophies, Confucius. If I didn't understand those, what meditation was and their descriptions of the inner world, I would not have achieved that on my own in this world either. Neither of those things would have happened. And I think they're in order. I needed to have an understanding of my human condition, and then being able to meditate and be able to understand my inner world. And then the plants became very, very useful. But it doesn't necessarily have to be in that order. So sorry for interrupting you, but that's my 2 bits. Is maybe you're that much smarter than I am, but I do feel a little doffed from time to time. So, maybe that's it. So what did I interrupt? Sorry.
No, I mean, you're online exactly with what you're discussing. I was actually going to ask you at the end what you thought about with your plants, whether it's taking you some. No, there's absolutely no doubt. I mean, there's some places that many people who work, for instance, with ayahuasca, we all commonly speak about it, as though we all know that place, but it's not something that you could ever describe to someone else. And another thing that's really interesting is, we were joking the other day on this conversation we're having is we had a conversation in one of the shamanic groups, and the conversation was how many people here were atheists before they drank ayahuasca, and about 50 people popped out in this conversation. And what's incredible is what a lot of them were saying is that they had even done different things and psychedelics before, but they really believed that it was a random firing of the brain. But some of these intelligences, as you know, when you plug into it, the first thing it shocks you, especially ayahuasca, is how gentle it is, as in the loving presence. I mean, it might gently pull your hand through 10 minutes of tears or crying or at some stage, but the intelligence to it. But the other thing that's incredible is how often people that are together or report a very similar thing. There's often themes in a room. There's often certain animals that everybody experiences at the same time. And there's things like the snake that rises. It's something that the one plant just shows everybody certain things. Something like 10% of people report actually meeting some of the plants and can draw it for you, which is absolutely fascinating, which you know about. Yeah. So it's a very interesting conversation. And I agree with you, because essentially how we started here is I do actually think that it makes sense, though, if there's an invaluable spiritual tool, that it would actually come from Mother Nature, from plant DNA. That makes perfect sense to me.
I have 2 last questions for you to probably wrap this up, at least this session of it, is so now that you have been facilitating, being the shaman, if you will, for these ayahuasca ceremonies that you've been leading, what have you learned what has been your greatest learning because you've been facilitating about yourself? And then what is the thing that you've learned about other people? Specifically because you've been, facilitating ayahuasca ceremony.
Sure, that's a really, really interesting question. I think for myself, the most important thing I've taken out of the whole thing is something that I really battle to express to people, but I've released the need to think that there is a truth that is one-sided. So the way it's affected me the most is the way, if I could explain it like this, if I ask a question, I'm seeing it from a certain perspective. And whenever you get an answer, you imagine you're on a chessboard and you're on a certain square. An answer is always based on an angle. And I think the one thing is really interesting that it's done for me is I tend to look at issues from above the chessboard. It sounds negative to some people, but you could give me a question regarding anything from controversial, from abortion to, and I could actually argue at all sides for you. And the really confusing thing for people is that I actually believe both sides of what I'm discussing. So I think that for myself, it's releasing from what you would call a very dualistic side of truth and realizing that the reason these issues have existed for so long is because they have multi-layered aspects to them. Like every single event, even an argument between your husband and your wife, there is always far more going. So that would be for me. For people,
Before you, just to clarify with you, just to clarify what you've said so far is that this being able, the 40,000 foot, view of things, would you call that, having a perspective? Is that you've got a much greater perspective as opposed to a one-dimensional, dualistic shoulds and shouldn'ts kind of way of looking at things, that you have a much higher perspective of that you're able to see much more of the whole, which I'm assuming makes your life easier.
Yes, I would say it gives you a multi-dimensional perspective, but I don't know if it makes your life easier, and I'll tell you why. I went through a bit of a crisis the first few years as I started to keep things this way, because I started to ask myself questions like, does this mean you don't have an opinion about anything? And in some ways I didn't. And does this mean you don't see anything? Because no matter what was going on, I felt quite lonely in the beginning because people would be arguing and someone would say, but can't you see what they're doing? But honestly, what I was experiencing is I could experience why you were angry, but I could experience why they were angry. And honestly, I couldn't take a side because I could see how that, you know what I mean? So the problem is it made life difficult for me. And then I realized the difference between taking a stance on something and actually holding some sort of a virtue. And they're very different to me. So I cannot take a stance on something. Like, for instance, I might eat the way a vegan does. I would never call myself a vegan. It's a box. It's a stance. But I can hold the virtue to love beings. So it took me a while to find balance. I don't know if I'm making sense, but I essentially had a crisis for many years. I'm like, wow, I've gone so deep into these plants that they've removed all opinions from me. Who does that make me? What does it make me?
Right. But so the question that you, the question that people actually have to deal with is they're so used to that I'm this body and I'm this set of opinions and that I am this identity, when everything that they used to hang their hat on, that this is me, starts evaporating in front of them. There's an existential crisis of, well, if I'm not all of that, am I growing crazy? Is there something wrong with me? What have I done? That kind of thing?
Exactly that. I mean, I couldn't describe it better. It's a bit of a crisis. It's like, well, you don't realize how much of your personality is based on your opinions. And I'll give you an example. Best Friends, if you go to a braai and you watch Best Friends, and this sounds cynical, this is me as well, we are united by our attitudes or opinions on certain things. That's why we're friends. If you watch two ladies or men, it could just be that you dislike someone and you'll both have your drink talking about the fact that you align very strongly. And there's a deep loneliness that comes for people that have journeyed like you and I at certain stages, because to release that charge and that self-righteousness of this is how things are and you were wrong and I was right, and to just float slightly into what I call the multidimensional mind, you've almost got to learn to communicate in a new way, to teach, to show people that I am hearing you. And it was a very tricky one for me, but that you're not charged in the same way anymore. So that's
Yes.
why I can hold a virtue, but I don't hold moral stances. It's very different to me.
Yeah. I call that evolving, frankly, and raising your frequency. And that the words that I have for it, how friends agree is that at the heart of every friendship is a conspiracy, that they both believe the same things. So,
Exactly.
those are the people that we can hang out with, is the ones we can speak the most truth with. And that we can speak the most truth with is because we agree about the finer points to a degree. So beautiful. Okay, now the last question, was the part B of that, was what have you learned about what's been most useful to you about what you've learned about other people by facilitating ayahuasca ceremonies?
I think what I've learned about most people is that there are only about 6 to 8, just to be playful, ideas that are very planted in our minds that completely disempower us. And that those ideas are so common amongst people, especially spiritual people, that it actually becomes quite scary. After a few hundred, after a few thousand people, you start realizing everybody's tripping up on the same kind of stuff. And
Yes.
what I've most learned about people is something that I only knew logically, and that was in text and things, is that quite literally they are exactly as I am. They are exactly like me. They have just kind of expressed their neuroses. I always say that all that other person you can't understand is someone who's expressing their pain differently to you.
Yeah.
And I think that just to actually experience that same core inside everybody as you watch them emerge out of their plant experience, some of them never having their hearts open before, some of them never having a godlike experience before. And as soon as what I call it kicking the door down, or the clay falling off them, as soon as they come out the next day, whether they've cried for an hour or whether they've giggled all night, which you've experienced as well, listening to people just get through the whole thing because of how beautiful
And
it is.
interchanging between both.
What comes out the next day is essentially a group of people that when we drop all the bullshit, you just see me looking at you, you looking at you, looking at you. It's hard to tell the difference between the group. You're all on that same level of love. It's so easy to share. And that we're
Yes.
all just really scared children at the end of the day. That's,
Yeah.
I think, that I've learned about most people.
I would reflect that back to you is that what I hear you saying is that at the heart, that people are more or less the same in the fears that they have indoctrinated themselves in and been socialized in, and that there's a similarity amongst them, not exactly the same. You're your own unique snowflake, but at the same time, you're exactly the same as anybody else is. And then on the flip side of being able to be able to experience the creation in them, the part of the design that they are, and that there is a profound design around them, that all of them have that experience and can see people as equals at the highest level, maybe even the miracle level that we are, and be able to share that in a real humble and kindness, and just so many levels of nonsense being stripped away. So is that pretty good?
Yeah, that's really powerful. I mean, I think in closing, let me give you an example of what we've been discussing here, of a similar fear of us, how we facilitate. Let's talk about death quickly. One of those fears that we all hold in common. Some people just don't think about it a lot. Some people go through stages, but people are terrified of death. And even though you all have different beliefs, you only have an idea of what's going to happen. You actually don't know for sure. And as Freud said, and as Jung spoke about, but as shamans spoke about for thousands of years, the fear of death or your mortality is driving everything from the way that you are impatient to the way that you love. So why I discuss that is we all share this absolute incredible fear of our supposed demise. And one of the first things you facilitate as you go deeper into the shamanic path is people come out of one of their first few experiences and go, I know this sounds insane, but I died. And I was really scared for a few minutes, and then it was bliss. And then I realized I wasn't dead anymore. And these kind of things would scare people to hear on the outside. But what happens once a person has experienced themselves and realizes that death is just a birth on the other side, and they don't have to take somebody's word for it. They don't have to believe a book. They don't have to believe that middleman that we've always been manipulated through. That's their own personal experience. Now what you've done, you've helped somebody remove one of their core driving fears, death.
Yes.
And that's just an example of how I say we're all very similar. And that's why there are certain things that you can tackle with plants, which we call initiations. And it just really changes the game. Our relationship with death is one of the most important and most discussed things in all forms of shamanism. The beginning and the ending, the alpha and omega, the rebirth after the closing of a cycle. Yeah.
Beautiful. So in closing, I just want to say a few words about you, is that my experience of the plants, and in your case, ayahuasca, is always been a beautiful experience for me, and that you have to find out what, if you're curious, you have to find out what your relationship with that plant is, because it's going to be different. But I really do enjoy your particular takes on shamanism, the shaman that I consider you to be. I've been in your ceremonies more than once, and very much have enjoyed it, and think that you hold the space beautifully, that you give beautiful reflections to people. Most importantly, you leave them to their own devices unless they absolutely put up their hand and ask for help. So, which I think is imperatively beautiful, to be able to have people be accountable for that, and them knowing all they need to do is ask for help, and them nodding that they understand that on the outset. It's a beautiful space, you know, just to be able to really articulate the music of it's kind of like the music and the chanting and the words create a frequency that leads you into, is congruent with the frequency of the plants, and that it keeps you in a line with the plants until it just very gracefully hands you over to the plant, and then brings you back down to, you know, you and your life. So I think it's really well done. And it's, you know, from my perspective, and it's not my first rodeo, is that I really do think that you have a lot to offer. So anybody that's interested, I'll definitely connect them with you to be able to do that.
Thank you so much.
Is there any final words from you?
No, I think just, yeah, thank you for that, and just thank you for your time. You and I seem to have very powerful conversations, and I think we touched on some interesting things there, and I think I would love to dive down the line into a little bit more, but I think tonight it feels perfect, and yeah, thank you for your input.
Beautiful. Well, thank you very much, and that until next time, I think this will be the beginning of a beautiful relationship, I think, at least on podcast. So thank you very much, and we will continue from here. Thanks, Nathan.
Thank you.
Peace.
Okay.